the common law of medieval Europe, as it would remain in place until the age of Napoleon, was Roman law as redefined and reformed by Justinian.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine.
He was a ruler of insalubrious beginnings, maligned as a peasant, who was nearly lynched by a mob of angry sports fans, and even had a plague named after him. Yet, as Peter Sarris tells Kev Lochun, Justinian was in fact one of the greatest Byzantine emperors. A man who remade the Eastern Roman Empire and whose influence stretched well into the medieval era.
Welcome to this Life of the Week episode on Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. I'm delighted to be joined today by Peter Sarris. Peter is Professor of Late Antique, Medieval and Byzantine Studies and a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He's also the author of Justinian, Emperor, Soldier, Saint. So all round, an excellent guest to talk about Justinian. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
You're most welcome. I wonder, as a place to start, could you introduce us to who this man is and why he's such a big figure in this period of history?
Justinian is a figure who really in many ways bestrides the transition from the ancient world to the medieval, and at a crucial moment in time tries to reunite the worlds of the Eastern and Western Mediterranean, which in the century before his reign, in the 5th century, had been fragmenting and drifting apart. So he comes to power in the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople in the early 6th century. And his reign will herald a major attempt to revive the East Roman state, to conquer territories in the West which had been lost to the Roman Empire over the course of the 5th century. His reign will witness a concerted attempt to fully Christianize Roman society, and through his efforts at imperial reform, at imperial revival, and at Christianization, he will help to lay the foundations for both the world of medieval Byzantium, but also in many ways will lay the foundations for the world of medieval Christendom as it would take shape to the West in the centuries ahead. So he's a key figure at a key moment of transition in European and in many ways in world history.
He's such an interesting figure. There's a question you write in your book you've been asking yourself over 30 years about, did Justinian ruin the empire he sought to restore? I just wonder, in the context of that brilliant introductory answer you gave us, where you sit on that today.
It's a question I was first set when I was an undergraduate student, as you say, over 30 years ago, and it's one I've been pondering since. As I mentioned earlier, Justinian's reign will witness this attempted and actual expansion of the Roman Empire, the recapturing of lost territories, and historians have often argued that the consequence of this period of expansion would be a critical overexpansion. In the century after Justinian, in the 7th century, the Roman world would again suffer a major period of collapse when many of the Western territories he had clawed back from Western barbarians were again lost, but also when crucially core territories of the Eastern Roman Empire in Syria, Palestine, Egypt would be ultimately conquered by the Arabs and the nascent faith of Islam. And historians have often tried to come up with some causal connection between Justinian's expansion and the subsequent collapse. At the end of the day, I don't think we can plausibly establish that causal connection. The great unraveling that the Roman world would suffer from the second half of the 6th century and into the 7th was really the result of circumstances almost entirely beyond imperial control. And really, these external crises, migratory pressures from new barbarian foes, climate disruption, and mass pandemic, I think are the real causes of the imperial crisis that Justinian's successors would inherit and would have great difficulty containing.
This is fascinating because he's this figure who comes in, oversees this kind of almost resurgence, but then immediately after his reign, or shortly after his reign, begins a bit of like almost a retraction of those gains. He's a man who gets a plague named after him, which we're definitely going to come on to in a bit. Let's take him back to the beginning. What really struck me when I was reading about Justinian is he exemplifies an incredible amount of social mobility. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about his early life and how his rise begins.
So Justinian comes from the most war-torn provinces of the Roman world in the mid to late 5th century. I should emphasize the background is that in the earlier part of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire the sections of the Roman Empire that embraced Italy, North Africa, Spain, Gaul, Britain, had fallen out of Roman rule, had fragmented, and had become the preserve of new kingdoms, primarily ruled over by new warlords of non-Roman origin. So in the preceding century, the Western Roman Empire had disappeared. And around the time Justinian is born, in the late 5th century, his homeland, in what's now southern Serbia, was nominally still part of the Roman Empire, but now the Eastern Empire ruled from Constantinople, but had been victim to enormous military disruption and chaos across the troubled years of the 5th century. Had been attacked and ruled over by Huns, by other barbarian groups such as the Goths. So his homeland is one of the most war-torn and disrupted parts of what remains of the Roman Empire. Now, to understand his own rise to power, we have to go back to his uncle. His uncle, a figure known as Justin, is from the same neck of the woods. He's born in the middle years of the 5th century, at the height, really, of the disruption of this part of the Roman Empire. He's born into extreme poverty. We're told by a later source that he's a swineherd. And faced with poverty at home, he and a couple of friends decide to throw caution to the wind and try to forge a new life for themselves and walk to Constantinople. This would have taken them several weeks. They arrive in Constantinople, their backpacks on their back, as it were, and they arrive in Constantinople at a crucial moment because the new emperor in Constantinople at that time, Leo, is engaged in reforming the imperial guard. The men of the Balkans had long been regarded as prime recruiting fodder in the Roman world. They were regarded as tall and strong and making good soldiers. And Justin and his friends catch the eye of the recruiting officer, and they're recruited into the palace guard. Now, this is an extraordinary piece of luck because it suddenly places Justin at the heart of power in the greatest city in the known world, operating ultimately as the captain of guards in the palace of Constantinople. His rise to power begins. He ends up in his 60s ultimately, after a career on the front line and elsewhere, as head of the palace guards. In the year 518, however, there's a disputed succession for the imperial throne. None of the aristocratic families who regard the throne as really belonging to them are able to agree on a successor to the emperor who had just died. And instead, they alight on Justin, this Balkan army officer, as a sort of compromise candidate. He's an old man. They agree to make him emperor, probably in the expectation he won't be around for long, and that next time they can find a properly posh successor to fill the throne. Justinian's uncle, Justin, has become emperor around the year 518. Now, Justin has had a very successful career. He's also been blessed with a very happy marriage, but he and his wife do not have children. So Justin writes home to his sister and tells her to send him her son, originally known as Petrus, who comes to Constantinople probably when he's about 8. And this is our future Emperor Justinian. Then, with his uncle as emperor in 518, Justinian's own rise to power can begin.
A quote that you've written that Procopius has said about Justinian is that he's a result of an unholy sexual encounter between a peasant girl and a spirit. He is not portrayed as someone who is already of good standing. How much then can we ascribe Justinian's rise after coming to Constantinople to his uncle and that kind of nepotism versus his own nous? Because when I was reading about him, he actually seems quite conniving a lot of times.
The family is regarded with great sniffiness by political circles in Constantinople. But when Justin first comes to power, he is very careful not to simply line up his adopted son as the new heir to the throne. He does advance him. He makes him a general. Then ultimately, in the year 522, he will accord Justinian a very important political and ceremonial function as consul in Constantinople. But really, in order to secure his claim to power after Justin's death, Justinian has to machinate. He has to build up alliances at court, alliances in the army, alliances in the imperial church, in what is now a Christian Roman Empire. He has to buy up support on the streets of Constantinople by forging alliances with those who represent, as it were, the urban poor, the townsfolk. So he does engage in a very concerted campaign to build up support, to eliminate rivals. He's implicated in the assassination of a major rival to potential throne in 522. And only really by 525, when his uncle declares him to be deputy emperor or Caesar, do we see Justinian really being lined up as the heir apparent. What happens is his uncle Justin becomes very frail in 527 and rapidly makes Justinian co-emperor with him in the April of that year. In the August of 527, Justin then dies, leaving Justinian as sole emperor. But this is, the family has, both in the case of Justin and then Justinian, really come to power through combination of sleight of hand, the manipulation of circumstance, and the careful outmaneuvering of these very powerful aristocratic factions in Constantinople.
And what kind of tricks is he using to do that? I mean, I wonder, are there any specific kind of examples that made you think, oh yeah, this is peak Justinian?
Well, his predecessor as consul, who was a much admired general called Vitalian, is assassinated on the parade ground of the palace. And there are a number of sources which believe that Justinian is behind this assassination. But also, I think, more characteristically, he is forging alliances with members of the church to convey to the ecclesiastical leadership his sense of Christian piety, to try to buy up their support for when the crucial moment comes. And also, Constantinople is a city where you have these societies, these associations known as circus factions, the hippodrome of Constantinople, where chariot races take place, being the focus of much of the social but also political life of the city. These are in the hippodrome, you have these circus factions that support different chariot racing teams, and those circus factions become the focus of attention and loyalty on the part of young men of both aristocratic and more plebeian, lower class background, and hence can become major political forces on the streets of the capital. And Justinian is very careful to establish a connection with one of the strongest of these factions, the Blue faction. The point being, the leaders of the Blue faction will be well-connected, aristocratic young men whose lower class supporters can be paid or mobilized to riot or to demonstrate against unpopular imperial policies or unpopular claimants to imperial power. So he's trying to establish connections with every level, really, of Constantinopolitan political society before he's able to establish himself on the throne.
So we've covered the span of him arriving in Constantinople and becoming emperor. Within that window of time, that's when he meets Theodora, who will become his wife. And there's, I wouldn't say as a typical match, I wonder how you'd feel about it, but could you tell us about who she is and how they come to meet?
Well, once again, I think we need to place it in the family background, because I think one thing that really characterizes the men of Justinian's family is a very strong romantic streak. So his uncle and adopted father, Justin I, through his career in the palace guards, could have acquired for himself a very aristocratic bride. Instead, he marries an ex-slave girl with whom he's clearly madly in love, Lupicina. The closest English translation I can come up with is Foxy. So Justin I is married for love. Likewise, Justinian doesn't acquire himself a political bride. Instead, quite late in life, when he's approaching middle age, he forges a connection with and marries an extraordinary woman, Theodora, one of the most arresting figures, really, of this age. Theodora's background has in many ways been even more insalubrious than that of his uncle. His uncle was a swineherd, but we're told that Theodora, in her youth and childhood, had been forced into prostitution. She had been born into great poverty in Constantinople, where her father had been keeper of the bears that worked for the Green faction in Constantinople, the Blues and the Greens being the two great factions, the bears that performed in the hippodrome. He then dies, leaving Theodora and her sisters fatherless. The mother then forges a new marriage. The family have to go over and live instead now with the Blue faction, because the stepfather works for them, but clearly they are still very poor. And early in her life, Theodora and her sisters are made by their mother to dance around and ultimately on the stage of the hippodrome, and we are told to work as prostitutes. This is a world where not all prostitutes were actresses, but it is assumed that all actresses and dancers were prostitutes. And the claim that Theodora in her youth was forced to work as a prostitute is one made, of course, by sources hostile to Justinian and his wife, but also crucially by sources that are sympathetic to Theodora. She becomes a courtesan, a dancer, a prostitute, and becomes the mistress of a young man who's sent off to be governor of the Roman provinces on the borders of Egypt in Libya, acting as his concubine. There she seems to become pregnant, and he sets her aside. So Theodora is left with a child abandoned in Africa. She ends up then having to make her way back to Constantinople via Alexandria in Egypt, via Antioch in Syria, the greatest city of the Roman East. It's possible that in the course of this career, she discovers Christianity and discovers Christian faith. And when she returns to Constantinople, she is introduced to and forges a connection with Justinian, their point of contact being their common affiliation by this point with the blue faction of the Hippodrome. Justinian is clearly very much taken with her. He's probably forged an alliance with her by the year 521, but he's not allowed to marry her until 522, the reason being that his aunt and adopted mother, the ex-slave girl Lupicina, is very suspicious of Theodora, can't stand her, probably thinks that she's not good enough for her handsome, we're told, but still very much unmarried nephew and adopted son. And Justinian has to wait for his aunt and adopted mother to die before he can make an honest woman of Theodora. Extraordinarily, though, because she has been an actress or dancer, and because Justinian by this point has senatorial status, he has to persuade his uncle, the reigning Emperor Justin I, to change the law to allow Justinian, as a senator, to marry a woman who has formerly been engaged in what were regarded as insalubrious professions. And we see this law change being made and is there in the law books. So it's an extraordinary match. What they have in common by this point, I think, is a deep sense of Christian faith. On her part, the faith of a fallen woman. On his part, the interest of a young man who, even as an army officer, seems to have a quite striking interest in theology.
Let's talk about that a bit more, because when we were talking before the call, you were saying how much of what Justinian does is driven by his conviction, and specifically his religious conviction. Where does that develop for him?
Justinian is a young man and is coming to power at a time when the Roman Empire has become officially Christian, but when the process of Christianization is incomplete. But also, crucially, when there are major divisions that have emerged theologically within the imperial church over some quite complex issues. When his uncle has been made emperor, for example, there are attempts to engage in theological negotiations with the Pope in Rome. Justinian, just a guards officer in the palace at this point, though the son of a new emperor, starts writing to the Pope, starts trying to engage the Pope in discussion of theology, quotes St. Augustine to him, comments to the Pope on the merits and demerits of different theological solutions to the crisis of the day. This is really very striking and very unusual, and I think is indicative of a young man who, in some level, finds theology to be arresting and fascinating in an abstract sense, but who also feels that the religious struggles of the day go to the heart of the political predicament that the Roman Empire finds itself in. He believes that the loss of Roman power to the West, he believes that political crises in the Roman Empire at home are the result of a loss of divine favour, and that divine favour can only be restored through the religious catharsis and purification of the Roman state, and that requires the solving of the religious disputes of the period, and crucially, the pressing home with the more full-blown and complete Christianization of Roman society, which had been initiated by Constantine the Great in the 4th century, but which, to Justinian's mind, his predecessors to the throne had left incomplete due to their indolence and lack of zeal.
So let's jump straight into his reign then. You talked about his desire to Christianize the what is still the Roman Empire. How does he go about that?
Well, first of all, he does it through, there are what I would regard as there are carrots and there are sticks. The carrot approach is that he genuinely tries to engage theologically with those churchmen who are alienated from the official position of the imperial church. The issues at the heart of the theology are to do with the nature of the relationship between the human and divine in the person of Christ. We needn't go into those details here, but what's crucial is that people believe that if you believe incorrectly, your pathway to salvation is closed. Now, Justinian tries to find theological solutions to the theological disputes of the day, engaging with churchmen theologically, but also trying to coerce them by threatening to remove legal rights and legal protections from their subjects, their property rights, and so on and so forth. But this will culminate ultimately in a great council of the church held in Constantinople in 553, at which Justinian and his court theologians will define Christian faith and doctrine as it would then be inherited in the Middle Ages to both East and West. Justinian defines the faith of medieval Christendom, really, in many ways, at that council in 553. That's mostly carrot, with a bit of stick involved as well. The stick is mostly shown towards those non-Christian elements within Roman society. Very early in his reign, he institutes a major period of persecution of pagans. Previous Roman emperors in the Christian Empire since Constantine had banned acts of pagan sacrifice and had instituted other policies to make pagans feel more uncomfortable and to induce conversion. Justinian makes it illegal even to be a pagan. Pagans who refuse to convert are to be exiled, or if they make only false conversions, killed. He also applies a major downward pressure on the legal rights of his non-pagan but non-Christian subjects, such as the many Jews within the empire, the many Samaritans who remain in Palestine, those elements of the imperial church or the imperial Christian society who subscribe to a non-conformist or heterodox belief. So, as it were, he is recasting the Roman state legally into much more of a confessional state, a confessional society, in which your civil rights at law are really proportionate to your officially deemed degree of religious conformity and Christian orthodoxy. And that is pretty radical. Justinian is the first Roman emperor we know of who, probably responding to demands by more hardline elements within the imperial church, introduces a sort of blanket ban on men who have sex between men. This is very new. Roman law had hitherto been either relatively uninterested in sex between men, or in the context of the Christian Roman Empire, had been more concerned with cracking down on male prostitution. Justinian is the first emperor we know of who introduces a blanket persecution of men who have sex with men, irrespective of their role or irrespective of the context of those sexual activities.
I found it very interesting through all of that Justinian balances that faith with Theodora's background and his laws around the flesh trade, so to speak. What are your views on that?
Justinian's Christianizing agenda leads him on the one hand to unprecedented degrees of cruelty and persecution of those who he thinks are sources of corruption or immorality in the Roman state or are causes of divine displeasure. But the same Christianizing agenda, of course, also leads him to equally unprecedented degrees of charity, because Christianity enjoins concern for the poor and the marginalized and so on and so forth. So we see in Justinianic legislation, in the laws, the reforms Justinian pushes through, unprecedented concern, really, for the interests of the poor, orphans, those slaves who are freed from their slavery, those suffering from physical handicaps and disadvantages really emerge as a subject of legislation for the first time I've been able to track down in Roman law. So the charitable side of Justinian's reforming agenda is the flip side of his persecutory agenda. Now, I think as you indicate, within that, there is also the influence of his wife at work. I think that we can trace Justinian's wife, Theodora, as an active voice in his legislation. He admits, he openly acknowledges that he takes her advice on some of his legislation. And we can see her, I think, lobbying the emperor for some of these laws. And we have in particular legislation concerned with cracking down on pimps, cracking down on people trafficking, cracking down on flesh traders who go out into the countryside, luring country girls to Constantinople with promises of fancy shoes and clothes and food, or only to ensnare them in brothels. We have legislation trying to stop that. We have legislation trying to make it easier for women who are forced into careers on the stage, a euphemism really for prostitution, to escape that life. And there I think we see Theodora taking advantage of her proximity to the emperor to make life better, not just for herself, but for women like her who've been forced into similarly terrible circumstances. I think that is a very important aspect. Justinian is clearly devoted to Theodora. He often represents his reign as a sort of a period of joint rule. So he makes all governors in the empire, for example, swear an oath of personal loyalty, not just to him, but interestingly also to her, his God-given empress, as she is described.
You said that the regime was very much machinated against at times, and I wonder if it's a great place to hop back to something earlier in Justinian's reign, which was the Nika riots. I wonder if you could contextualise those for us.
As I mentioned before, the circus factions, the great sort of supporters clubs associated with the Hippodrome of Constantinople, were major players in imperial politics, as well as major participants in the ceremonial and sporting life of the empire through events in the Hippodrome and the chariot races there. Their activities were also associated with considerable lawlessness. And in late 531, early 532, Justinian cracks down on rioting and lawlessness on the part of leaders of the circus factions by having the leaders of the two main factions, the Blues and the Greens, or at least some of their leaders, arrested and incarcerated. Essentially what we have here is an emperor who is in many ways drawn on the support of the Blue faction in particular to help stake his claim to power, now trying to put some distance between himself and what are regarded as potentially quite lawful, law-breaking or chaotic elements within a contemporary political society. Now, this arrest of the leaders of the circus factions goes down predictably very badly with the circus factions themselves, and the Blues and the Greens, the two most powerful of these factions, despite being bitter rivals, unite, and major riots break out on the streets of the capital to try to apply pressure on Justinian to release their leaders. Justinian holds firm, and the riots on the streets of the capital, in the Hippodrome, and crucially around the palace intensify. Witnessing this, elements within political society, elements within the Senate, elements within those more blue-blooded families that have never really felt that Justinian deserved a place on the throne, decide to try to take advantage of the mob of Constantinople and throw their support and weight behind the rioters, turning what has begun as an outbreak of civil disorder into a concerted attempt to drive Justinian from the palace and bring about a coup d'etat. And the rioters acclaim as a new emperor, a blue-blooded aristocrat who was a high-ranking member of the Senate of Constantinople, known as Hypatius. Justinian finds himself besieged in the imperial palace. The rioters are literally banging at the gates with the new claimant to imperial power, Hypatius, amongst their ranks in the Hippodrome, which is next to the palace. We're told by one contemporary source that Justinian considers taking flight, thinking he's got no hope really, just trying to hold out in the palace, and that maybe he'd be better off relocating himself out of the capital and reconsolidating his regime elsewhere. The person who, according to one important source, prevents this from happening is his wife, Theodora, who tells him that the imperial office is a noble burial shroud, and it's better for him to stand and fight rather than to leave the city in disgrace. Really strengthened and inspired, according to that one crucial eyewitness source, well, drawing on the testimony of someone who's probably in the court, Justinian decides to stand and fight. He gathers his most loyal generals around him in the palace, and he unleashes them with their military retainers against the rioters concentrated in the Hippodrome. And a massive slaughter takes place, with perhaps somewhere in the region of 30,000 rioters killed. It's possible that by the end of these civil disturbances, perhaps somewhere in the region of 3 to 5% of the population of Constantinople ends up being slaughtered. So the discontent of the circus factions, has been taken advantage of by Justinian's political opponents within the Senate and beyond to try to drive him from the throne. There's a crucial moment when it looks as if they might succeed, but he just about manages to hang on, albeit he's only able to hold on through engaging in mass slaughter, really, at the heart of this great and supposedly Christian capital.
It's quite incredible, isn't it? And is that the greatest threat Justinian faces for his reign, do you think?
Well, it is the closest he gets to abandoning the throne, and it is, I think, the closest he comes to completely losing the empire. But it's important to bear in mind that there will be plots and conspiracies against him down to the very end of his reign, into the 560s, when he's already a very old man in his late 70s and early 80s. And I think it's a sign of how unpopular a lot of his domestic reform agenda in particular is, that those machinations and plots never stop.
The Nika riots give Justinian the opportunity to rebuild the Hagia Sophia. And I just wonder if you tell us a bit like why that's such a momentous thing.
Yeah, so the rioters do enormous harm to the monumental heart of Constantinople. A lot of damage is done to the Hippodrome, which is directly adjacent to the imperial palace. The great cathedral church of Hagia Sophia, which had stood there before, has been destroyed, as have many other buildings, such as the Senate House, the head of the civil service, the so-called Praetorium. These riots leave the monumental heart of Constantinople a smouldering wreck. But of course, this now provides Justinian with an opportunity to rebuild the monumental heart of Constantinople in his own honour, in many ways, as one architectural historian put it, turning the city of Constantine into the city of Justinian. And we see Justinian engaging in this major building programme, particularly focused on building churches in this capital as part of his Christianising agenda, the greatest of which will be his new rebuilt cathedral church of Hagia Sophia, built according to dramatically new architectural principles as this vast dome structure. It will be, throughout the Middle Ages, the greatest and largest place of Christian worship, the greatest cathedral in Christendom. It would be really the largest enclosed space anywhere in terms of its internal height, largest dome structure anywhere until the 16th century. And it is a monument, a cathedral, which would dominate the medieval city of Constantinople as a testament to Justinian's own determination to dominate the empire, and it would inspire both Christian and Islamic architecture in the centuries ahead.
So that's certainly one of his legacies. So too is the religious export into the medieval era that you mentioned earlier. One we haven't touched on is one of his bigger law reforms, the Corpus Juris Civilis.
Yes, so Justinian comes to power feeling that the empire is in a state of legal disarray. So many laws have been issued by previous Roman emperors. So many legal opinions, citable in court, have been issued by legal scholars, that it's often very difficult to ascertain what the law on any given issue is. And restoring true order to the Roman Empire is for Justinian bound up with restoring legal order. And we see him engage in this major programme of legal reform and legal codification. There are two different aspects here. Legal reform first. In the context of legal reform, we have this massive outpouring of legislation when Justinian becomes emperor to crack down on tax evasion, to reform provincial administration, to crack down on pagans, non-Christians and others. The pace of legislation under Justinian compared to previous emperors is almost extraordinary. I mean, we have something over 30 laws from the 8.5-year period of reign of Justin I, Justinian's uncle. For the equivalent period of Justinian's reign, we have over 400 laws. This is a dramatic uptick, really indicative of Justinian's vision of a much reformed and much more aggressively administered empire. But alongside this, we have this determination to now impose order on Roman law through codifying and reforming the laws inherited from previous emperors, and the legal opinions inherited from the legal scholars. And he does this early in his reign with the promulgation, first of all, of the Codex Justinianus, the Justinianic Code, where he reforms and edits the laws of all previous Roman emperors of the preceding centuries, reforming them so as to express a single unified vision and will, represented as that of Justinian himself. We see it in the extraordinary boiling down and editing of the inherited legal opinions of the legal scholars. These would be gathered together in a much reduced form in the so-called digest. In the course of this, he actually jettisons 95% of the texts his legal scholars have been having to work on. But even the text he produces in the form of the digest, this great codified vision of jurisprudential writing, is 1.5 times the size of the Bible. He then caps this with a new legal textbook, a new map of the Reformed law, which he terms the Institutes. These 3 works, the Codex, the Digest, the Institutes, transform the inherited body of Roman law. As I say, they convey a new vision of law represented as that of Justinian. And absolutely crucially, this is then the form in which civil law, Roman law, the basis of legal actions and rights, will be inherited not just in the remaining Roman Empire, but across the entirety of Christendom in the centuries ahead, as Roman law, as reformed by Justinian, would be disseminated, received, and learned. So this is really, again, one of Justinian's greatest achievements. The common law of medieval Europe, as it would remain in place until the age of Napoleon, was Roman law as redefined and reformed by Justinian. And even Napoleon's own codification is underpinned by Justinianic principles, such that law, the legal systems that apply in much of continental Europe today, as indeed in Scotland, ultimately owe much of what drives them and gives them order, the legal vision of Justinian and his courtiers.
That's such a huge legacy, and one that's persisted for so long, which is a bit of a counterpoint to how long his military expansions lasted. I mean, we've talked very much about domestic issues for now. I wonder if we turn our attention outwards.
First of all, his chief military priority throughout his reign is the East, where the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, faces the other great superpower of the West Eurasian world at this time, the Sasanian Empire of Persia or Iran. The Romans face down the Persians in the Caucasus. They have to face them in Syria, with the Roman-Persian frontier running essentially where the boundary now is between Syria and Iraq. They are vying for control of trade across the Indian Ocean. The Persians are the other great power the Romans always have to keep an eye on, and containing the Persian threat is Justinian's chief military priority. That having been said, he is very aware that Roman fortunes have gone into decline in the West, that Roman territory has been lost, and he takes advantage of a series of internal political disputes in the kingdoms that had emerged in the West to restore Roman control. These new societies in the West, in North Africa, in Italy, in Spain and beyond, these were new king-focused societies ruled by monarchs and their dynasties. The great weakness of a king-focused society is that if you have a struggle for power at the top, if you have a disputed succession, the whole kingdom becomes, at that moment in time, both politically and militarily, very vulnerable. This is something Justinian and his courtiers, observing these newly emergent kingdoms in the West, have learned. And so crucially, at a series of moments that are structurally parallel, first of all in 533 in Africa, then in 535 in Italy, then ultimately in the 550s in Spain, Justinian's regime will take advantage of disputed succession disputes and internal disputes at the top of these new king-focused societies and those kingdoms to intervene militarily when those societies are at their weakest. Now, you say he's not a frontline fighting soldier himself, but one characteristic of Justinian is he's got a great eye for talent. His internal fiscal reforms, he talent spots a great administrator, John the Cappadocian. For his legal reforms, he talent spots a brilliant practicing lawyer, Tribonian, who he puts in charge of a lot of the codification project. And for his Western military ventures in particular, but also to some extent on the East, he turns to a soldier whose talent he had spotted probably during his own time as a general, a young man called Belisarius, to whom he entrusts his early Persian campaigns, then the campaign that leads to the rapid conquest of Africa in 533, and then the campaigns that will lead Roman forces into Sicily in 535, Rome in 536, and Ravenna, the capital of the Gothic kingdom of Italy, in 540. So his ability to talent spot and to find men whose skills and ambition chime with and match his own is absolutely vital to how Justinian consolidates and holds on to power.
Honestly, it all sounds like it's going quite well. He's regained all this territory. He's reformed all these laws. He's built this amazing structure. Where does it all start to change for him? You mentioned in your book of 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Obviously, things have almost gone very badly wrong for him in 532. He manages to regain his resolve and takes advantage, as it were, of the aftermath of the Nika riots to stamp his authority on Constantinople. I think the aftermath of the Nika riots is also very important in terms of the launching of these campaigns to the west. I think the decision to take advantage of the weakness of the Vandal kingdom and then the weakness of the Gothic regime in Africa and Italy, respectively. This is partly post the Nika riots, him having to reach out to conservative elements who dream of a revival of Roman fortunes. He's also reaching out to elements in the church at that moment in time as well. So I think that's part of a broader policy agenda. And as you say, it's going pretty well. I think what then starts happening is that circumstances beyond the emperor's control start to intervene. Firstly, in the mid-530s, as these campaigns to the west are going on, we suddenly have a major period of climatic instability and change, which is recorded by a number of eyewitness accounts stretching from Ireland to Japan. A major period of climatic disruption across the northern hemisphere as a whole, which historians have come to associate with a series of enormous volcanic eruptions from Central America through to Iceland that cast vast amounts of material into the stratosphere, cause major disruption to agriculture, and leads to what some historians have called a late antique little ice age. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it gives one a sense of the sudden disruption at that moment in time. Now, disrupting agriculture, of course, affects the tax revenues on which the empire is dependent for these military adventures, because the army is paid for and sustained with tax revenues. So that's the first thing. I think the climatic context in which warfare is taking place is transformed. Also, I think that this sudden climate change intensifies a contemporary sense of crisis and intensifies the strong apocalyptic expectations that are a feature of the period. The climate disruption then appears to be an important background for the other great cataclysm, really, or the great cataclysm which befalls the empire. Arguably the most important event to happen in Western Eurasia in the 6th century, the sudden emergence of bubonic plague. We know the bubonic plague developed in antiquity in Central Asia. It may have reached Western Eurasia through trade with Central Asia. It is possible it had focalized in southern Arabia or East Africa prior to the reign of Justinian in the centuries that preceded him. But in the year 541, the bubonic plague suddenly makes its appearance, seemingly via the Red Sea, in the Egyptian port town of Pelusium, and then spreads rapidly to Alexandria, Jerusalem, through Palestine, Syria, reaching Constantinople very rapidly in the year 542 to 543, then spreading throughout the empire like wildfire. Now, bubonic plague, in the absence of modern medicine, is one of the most deadly diseases known to mankind, and the demographic impact of this disease would appear to have been largely comparable to that which we encounter several centuries on in Europe in the context of the Black Death. So we have this tsunami of misery suddenly sweeping the empire with the Justinianic plague in the 540s, and that plague would then recur in the decades ahead. Now, of course, the plague brings much human misery, but again, the plague rapidly diminishes the number of taxpayers on whom the state can rely. And in the context of an empire in which Justinian needs to raise taxes, to fund armies, to pursue warfare to east against Persia and to the west against these barbarian kingdoms, this is a really ominous development. And from that point on, I think we start seeing troubles mounting, as Justinian finds it harder and harder to extract the tax revenues on which his regime depends.
And Justinian, of course, he catches this plague and he survives it.
Yes, we have some coinage minted in Constantinople around this time, which may even depict the emperor with buboes under his chin or around his neck, which then disappear in subsequent issues of the coinage. It may be that this coinage is minted as a message to the population of the capital that the emperor's recovery will be the empire's recovery. And in the years after, the first round of the plague, which I say will keep on returning, and then Theodora's death in 548. I say initially this regime looks like both the emperor and the court have been knocked off balance. But as we move into the 550s, the regime will regain its composure. We will see new campaigns launched in Spain and a number of important diplomatic and military adventures elsewhere. But I think the crucial point to note, however, is that this reconfiguration of the world in the empire and beyond it, caused by great external forces, would continue. So late in Justinian's reign, we see, as I say, renewed migratory pressures on the empire's frontier from Central Asia, where we see a new barbarian threat in a group known as the Avars establish themselves along the empire's northern frontiers. And in the decades after Justinian's death, pressures caused by the Avars would lead to a major weakening of the imperial position in the Balkans and also in the reconquered territories of Italy. So, Justinian can try to achieve an enormous amount by trying, in his own mind, to regain divine favour. He can achieve a great amount by cracking down on tax evasion, by trying to restore legal order to the empire. But at the end of the day, he's unable to surmount these great impersonal forces that sweep down on the empire from the mid-540s onwards: climate change, plague, migratory pressures from the world as far away as Central Asia.
The death of Theodora, how did that affect him, in the sense that earlier in this conversation we were talking about how very much he was a co-ruler and was so involved with all his laws, but do we see a change in governance with her absence?
Well, the late 540s are a period of considerable torpor in imperial legislation. So legal enactments issued from the court and the chancery almost dry up. This could be due to institutional paralysis caused by the plague. It could be caused by the death of Justinian's chief legal officer, Tribonian, who dies in 542, possibly of plague. It could be, again, compounded by the psychological impact of Theodora's death. We're told by the contemporary historian Procopius that Justinian's commanders in the West worry that after Theodora's death in 548, that he simply lost interest in the Western campaigns. But what I think we really see after her death, and also in the wake of the arrival of the bubonic plague, which again Justinian interprets as a sign of divine displeasure and as a punishment from God, is a even more intense preoccupation with religious endeavours and the emperor's determination again to crack down on non-Christians, to crack down on those whom he regards as immoral, and to attempt to finally impose a solution on the theological divisions within the imperial church. Hence, I think that period between the advent of the plague in 542 and the death of Theodora and the Great Council of 553 is absolutely crucial. But it's also important to bear in mind that once Justinian has regained some of his composure as we get into the 550s, some of the most creative and important achievements of his reign again will be embedded.
We've got towards the end of his life, so he dies in 565. At no point in this conversation have we crossed anyone who might be his successor. Is that an oversight on his part? Is that calculated?
I think it's very deliberate. The Roman Empire ruled from Constantinople, this great Eastern Roman Empire, the greatest city in Western Eurasia, in the known world in the early 6th century, is a world that is controlled from the palace. If you control the palace, you control the empire. That's probably why, in fact, Justin I, though coming to power as a very old man, is very careful not to line up Justinian himself too obviously as his successor early in his reign, because the trouble is, if there's a very obvious successor, it's very easy for hopes of regime change and for hostility to the regime to coalesce around that figure and suddenly make an usurpation or a coup much more likely and much easier to achieve. So I think that's already informing the policy of his uncle Justin I, and I think that informs Justinian's policy throughout. Now, he and Theodora remain childless. I don't think that's deliberate. We have evidence or indications that they are trying for children into the 530s, but they end up childless, but he never adopts. He does appoint members of his broader family male members of his broader family to high-ranking military office. He trusts many of his cousins and nephews to be generals, but he makes very sure that there is no obvious successor to the throne, as I say, I think for the simple reason that he doesn't want hopes for regime change to coalesce around any one obvious figure, given how unpopular so many of his policies have been. Likewise, although his armies will campaign as far afield as southern Spain and the northern Caucasus, and although his diplomatic adventures will involve missions engaging with diplomats from as far afield as Western Britain to Central Asia and possibly Sri Lanka, the emperor is only known to leave Constantinople twice, very late in his reign, when he's very elderly, on trips that may have really been sort of convalescence voyages as he's starting to fall ill and to get frail. Why does he never leave Constantinople? Because he knows if he leaves that court, given how unpopular he is, there'll be a new emperor sitting on his throne before he knows it. He's been raised at court by his uncle. He understands the dynamics of power. He understands the person who controls the court controls this empire. And he's willing to control it with Theodora, but without her, he has to do it himself.
Brilliant. And just as a very quick closing question, how should we remember Justinian today?
Justinian is an emperor who was absolutely obsessed with his own personality cult. To a far greater extent, I think, than any Byzantine emperor, with the sole exception of Constantine the Great, who founded Constantinople and began Christianizing the empire. He's determined to dominate the skyline and cityscape of Constantinople. He imposes his name as well as his vision on the empire's laws. He emplaces his name on inscriptions in buildings all over the Balkans and far beyond, and recasts the area where he was born by building a great city there, which he calls Justiniana Prima. So he's obsessed with image building and legacy. Yet bizarrely, his own direct legacy in the centuries ahead would often be mixed. In the decades after his death, many would look back on him as a tyrant, as a persecutor. To some, he was regarded as a saint. To others, he was regarded as a demon. His real achievement lay not in terms of his direct legacy and direct memories of him. Really, his legacy and his achievements lay in the fields of law and theology, the two fields to which he was most personally committed, through the way in which he recast Roman law, as I mentioned earlier, as it would be received to both East and West, laying the legal foundations for Western Christendom and Western society as a whole. He will be remembered also for the way in which he recast and redefined the theology and faith, the intellectual and religious underpinnings of medieval Christendom, out of which all forms of modern Christianity ultimately emerge. And even his legacy in the Islamic world would be vast. By virtue, for example, of the way in which, after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, his great cathedral church of Hagia Sophia was kept as a mosque, even uniquely keeping its own name, its original name. Hagia Sophia would establish itself as the model for all future high-status mosque building across the Islamic world in the future. So his legacy and achievement lay not so much in terms of his own name recognition, but rather in terms of his achievements in the fields of law, faith, and architecture.